What is going on, everybody, and welcome to the very first episode of the JW Football Show. I am super excited to get this started. As many of you know, this is something I've wanted to do for a very long time, and I'm finally getting it done. All right, hopefully on this show, we're covering really all things NFL. For these first couple episodes, we're thinking about the draft and free agency, but throughout the season as well, hoping to cover, player performances, other team building stuff. So yeah, we're going to kind of see how it goes. Hope for nothing but the best. And what better way to get started than with covering my very own Chicago Bears? Let's get right into it. So, the Bears this year obviously exceeded pretty much everybody's expectations, right? First year of Ben Johnson. I think a lot of people questioned how were Ben Johnson and Caleb Williams going to work together? What was the new team going to look like? And of course, it went very well, right? You win the division for the first time in almost a decade, right? You win a playoff game for the first time in well over a decade. You get to beat the Green Bay Packers twice, which of course, for me and all the Bears fans is a huge win. You finally establish a franchise quarterback for the first time in God knows how long. So yeah, I think a lot of positivity coming out of this season, right? A lot of things went well for the Chicago Bears. However, still a lot of room for improvement, right? I think the defense, pretty much as a whole, needs a bit of an overhaul, honestly. I think Dennis Allen did a good job. I think he'll do a great job with better personnel. And a lot of tough decisions to make as far as this roster goes, right? We have a lot of internal free agents. And we'll kind of talk about it a little bit more in a second, but we can find a way to get a good amount of money to spend. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. So, right away, you see, right now, the Bears are listed as having negative $10 million in cap space. As many of you already know, cap space in the NFL is basically fake, right? It's real, but there's so many things you can do to adjust your cap space, to move money around. The Bears will be just fine. So even just looking at restructuring contracts, right? So you have guys like Montez Sweat, Jalen Johnson, Joe Tooney, Jonah Jackson, guys you're confident are probably going to be here for a little while, and are making quite a lot of money, right? So by just restructuring these guys' contracts and moving some guarantees around, we already go from being $10 million in the red to about $45 million in the green, which is just fine. And yeah, there's a name specifically left off here, that guy DJ Moore. And we're going to talk a little bit more about him in just a moment. So, now looking at some of these roster cuts, right? We're up to about $45 million, but I think we can get even more, right? Starting with, kind of the elephant in the room here, Tremaine Edmunds, right? I am a big Tremaine Edmunds fan. I think he's done a lot of good things for the Bears. However, I don't know if he's quite played up to his contract since joining the team a few years ago. Obviously, this year he misses a good chunk of the season with injury. I think especially after returning from injury, he just didn't look like the same player. I think there's too many coverage lapses. I think there's too many just misses on tape for him to be worth the $13 million we could save by cutting him. Again, you have to try to find a replacement, right? And it's not going to be easy, but I think it's definitely possible, especially factoring in you get $13 million by saving, or $13 million by cutting him, right? Amen Ogbongbemiga, actually at the time of recording, I'm recording this Saturday, February 21st. Amen was just cut, actually. So this was something that I kind of anticipated prior to recording on today, but he was cut, so we are going to save $2 million that way. He wasn't really part of the linebacker rotation. You have guys like Ruben Hippolyte and guys like Noah Sewell who are still on this roster for cheaper. And I think they played, about as well as he did, especially in Noah Sewell's case. So worth saving the $2 million there. And then Kieran Amagaji, a guy we drafted just a couple of years ago. I just don't think he's going to be able to carve himself out a role on this offensive line. Obviously, the offensive line was the biggest area of improvement this year. We have a lot of, solidified starters and veterans in that room. And after losing the left tackle battle and talks of moving to guard, and then you add on his injury problems with that, I think it's just better if we save the $1 million and kind of move on from him. So, after these roster cuts and restructures, right, we're looking very good, right? The numbers look good. We have a lot more cap space than we did. Let's get into a possible trade. So, I mentioned earlier, there's a guy missing from the restructure list, DJ Moore, right? And I am definitely not on the side of Bears fandom that says DJ Moore needs to be shipped out of town no matter what it takes. He's lazy. He's a bad for the team. I don't really buy into that stuff. I think he made so many big plays for the Bears this year. You look back at that Packer game, that catch he had in overtime. He has been, an absolute joy to have as a Chicago Bears fan. He oftentimes has shown to be Caleb Williams' number one target in big situations, and that's very valuable, right? Especially for a young quarterback. However, I don't know if it's more valuable than possibly acquiring a guy like Max Crosby, right? It seems like Max Crosby maybe is going to finally part ways with the Raiders. You bring in a new coach, it seems like they're finally hitting that full reset button. And I think if he's on the market, you got to go try to get him, right? You have a guy like DJ Moore who you could save some money by trading. I think you throw in our first round pick this year. And I think that will almost get it done. There's been talks of them wanting, the Raiders that is, wanting 2 first round picks plus a premium player in return for Max Crosby. I don't think I'd go as far as to trade this year's first round pick and next year's first round pick. It might take an additional mid-round pick to get this done. Call it maybe next year's third or something like that. But for our purposes today, we're going to call it DJ Moore and our first round pick this year in exchange for Max Crosby. And obviously adding a guy like Max Crosby, who is shown to be a defensive player of the year caliber player in his career already. A little bit of a down year this year. Really over the past 2 years hasn't quite had the same box score production, but still such an impactful player. Even if you just watch the Raiders play the Bears this year, he almost ruined that game, right? We obviously squeeze it out at the end. He picks off Caleb Williams. His pressure rate is super high. I think adding him to a defensive line that has Montez Sweat on the other side is only going to make his job even easier. He's an absolute Iron Man. He barely misses plays, right? He's one of the very few defensive linemen that plays pretty much every snap of every game. I think he fits exactly the culture Ben Johnson and Dennis Allen are trying to build. And with a quarterback on a rookie deal, you have to take advantage of that, right? This might be the only opportunity you have to pay 2 big-time defensive ends, right? Is when Caleb Williams is on his rookie deal. So, we clearly opened a Super Bowl window this past year. Obviously, we still have a lot of ways to go. But I think this is one huge step in the right direction as far as chasing that Super Bowl goes, adding a premier defensive player. So after bringing in a guy like Max Crosby, again, there's different ways this trade could go down. Maybe it's post-June 1st, maybe it's pre-June 1st, maybe it's at the draft. Who really knows? For our purposes, we're just going to say it happens today, right? I think you could save a little bit more money for both teams, maybe designating it post-June 1st, which is fine, right? Regardless, we have to take a look at all of these in-house free agents we have. Right, you have guys all over the defensive backfield, right? We have no safeties under contract for next year, which is obviously a problem, but we can fix it. You look at a guy like Nahshon Wright, I've seen his projection kind of all over the place as far as his contract goes. I've used Spotrac mostly. There's also Over the Cap I've looked at. I know PFF does contract projections. So he's projected to get, $16 million maybe, up to. I think that might be the high end. As far as his next contract goes, obviously he played really well at points this year. I'm not sure I'm willing to give him or get him back at that price point, just based on some of the inconsistency, right? Especially down the stretch. A guy like Jaquan Brisker, who I do love, he clearly lives and breathes Chicago Bears football. Again, just a guy who struggled with injuries over his career. I do think he played his best game, maybe as a Chicago Bear in that playoff game against the Rams. That's a game that I was there for in person, and his impact could definitely be felt. Kevin Byard, a veteran who Ryan Poles and Ben Johnson have already been vocal about wanting to bring back. Obviously an all-pro caliber player this year. He's into his mid-30s now, but still valuable enough to I think you'd consider bringing him back. A guy like Braxton Jones, who, in the past has been our starting left tackle. He kind of lost that job. You add in an injury this year. As much as I'd love to have him back, I'm not sure how realistic that's going to be just based on his projected role. Andrew Billings, a guy who has been a steady presence at the defensive line up until this year. I was less than impressed with what he put on tape this year. He's also, in his 30s now, so we'll talk about that in a second. Joe Tryon-Shoyinka, a guy who's interesting, a guy we traded for mid-season this year. I actually think he played pretty well, right? Is he a dominant edge rusher, a 10-sack kind of guy? No, but he was a solid run defender. He had a decent pressure rate. So that's something you'd consider. CJ Gardner-Johnson, another midseason addition, right? We picked him up off free agency. I think him stepping in place of Kyler Gordon worked out very well, right? He gave us a lot of meaningful snaps. I think with Kyler Gordon's injury history, he's a great insurance kind of policy for that. So we'll definitely think about bringing him back. Dom Robinson, a guy the Bears drafted, has really just never been anything more than a rotational guy for the Bears. So obviously it's a cheap number with a $2 million projection for his next contract. Not sure we'll think about that. We'll see. Olamide Zaccheaus seemed to very quickly become a guy a lot of Bears fans weren't a fan of. He had some costly drops this year, but he also made some pretty big plays. You know, he was pretty good as a wide receiver 4. I do think we can upgrade, but definitely a guy we'll still consider. Devin Duvernay, obviously a return specialist, didn't get much burn as far as a true receiver goes, but especially down the stretch, I thought he played really well as a returner. I think starting with that Vikings game that we win, he has that big return to get us into field goal range and ultimately win that game. I do think his services are very valuable, so we'll kind of consider bringing him back. We'll look at it in just a second. And then DeMarco Jackson, who in my opinion is one of the most intriguing guys on this list. I think going into the season, a lot of Bears fans, and maybe even the Bears, coaches in front office altogether, kind of anticipated him being more of a practice squad, kind of end of the chart, depth chart kind of guy. But he gave us some amazing, amazing play this year, especially with TJ Edwards and Tremaine Edmonds both missing significant amounts of time. I think he's kind of earned another contract, and I think we're going to give it to him, right? He's played great. I think he won Defensive Player of the Week one week, I believe, after that Browns game. And I think he'd be a great, kind of steady presence in the linebacker room that we already talked about is losing Tremaine Edmonds. So after looking at all these guys, let's look at some of the guys that might be a little bit more realistic to re-sign. So as far as re-signings go, I think there's 4 main guys we're looking to bring back. Starting with Kevin Byard, I think Ryan Poles is going to do pretty much anything he can to make sure Kevin Byard does not walk out of Hallis Hall. I think it would be like a 2-year, something like a $16 million deal. Again, an all-pro caliber player, but he is, well into his 30s at this point. I think if you can get 2 more great years out of him, help establish the culture Ben Johnson is trying to build, and then kind of, retire as a Chicago Bear, I think that'd be ideal for both parties, right? That's still a good chunk of money for Kevin Byard. CJ Gardner-Johnson, it is only a 1-year, $2.5 million deal, but he's a winner, man. It feels like everywhere he goes, the teams are pretty good, right? He makes a positive impact. I think the value he held for that Bears defense this year, especially with the absence of Kyler Gordon, is something you really want to bring back, right? I think he's worth it. I think giving him another shot, and even if he's more of a safety this year, right, with, as you can see, Jaquan Brisker being one of the guys we're letting walk, I think that'd be a valuable role too. So bringing him back to be a versatile piece in that secondary, I think is super important. Devin Duvernay, again, a guy that I think really picked it up at the end of the year. He's a very valuable return man. He was a former All-Pro as a returner. I think getting him back on a 2-year deal, again, keep that stability going. With these new kick return rules, I think he was starting to figure it out pretty well as far as the season, as long as the season went on. So we're bringing him back, and best case scenario, he's maybe a deep threat on offense. We'll kind of see if he can carve out a role that way. And then DeMarco Jackson, man, I think a guy that could earn even more money than this. I have him a 2-year, $3 million deal. I think a lot of other teams maybe won't value him as much as we do. So like if this was 2 years and even call it double that, $6 million, I think I'd give it to him, man. He's a really good player. I definitely became a huge DeMarco Jackson fan over the course of this year, and I really, really hope we bring him back and give him, a contract that keeps him as a Chicago Bear for a while, because it seems like he's kind of a Dennis Allen guy. So bringing those 4 guys back, I think mainly you're providing yourself some stability on defense during this kind of roster turnover period, and then bringing back a return specialist and possible, kind of 4th, 5th wide receiver in Devin Duvernay, I think very valuable as well. We go from about $52 million in cap space after that Max Crosby trade down to about $27 million, which is still plenty to make some meaningful additions in external free agency. So let's talk about that. As far as external free agency goes, I think there's 4 guys here that I would be really intrigued about bringing in, right? Number 1 being Alohi Gilman, longtime Charger safety, ends up in Baltimore this year. He is still an unrestricted free agent. Just in the next couple weeks, I think free agency officially starts on March 9th is the legal tampering period. But yeah, I think bringing him in, obviously on a cheaper deal than what you'd get Jaquan Brisker for, could be very helpful, right? This is a guy that played over 1,000 snaps this year and graded out really well, right? I know PFF grades aren't everything, especially when looking at offensive line. I think trying to decipher, responsibility can be very hard. So I'm just going to use some numbers as a reference point, right? He has a 72 coverage grade and a 70, almost 71 and a half run defense grade, right? Both are, the coverage grades top 25 as far as safeties go. The run defense grade about average as far as safeties go. And I think having that presence to go along with Kevin Byard, I think it'd be very valuable, right? Especially considering there's going to be so much roster turnover in that safety room. He's only 28 years old. You bring him in on a 2-year deal until he's 30. I think that makes sense, right? It makes sense for us. We're still in this winning window. He gets to be a part of a good team. And then for him, he gets another crack at another contract, another hopefully valuable contract by the time he's 30, 31 years old. So bringing him on a 2-year, about $9 million deal, you're looking at about 4.5 per year. I think his possible impact could even outplay a contract like that. But bringing him in, not to say he's solving the safety room, but I think at the very worst, he's a good stopgap option. In a similar light, I have Tim Settle. He was a part of that absolutely elite Texans front this year. Is he Will Anderson? Is he Danielle Hunter? No, right? He's an interior guy, 6'3", 313 pounds, 28 years old, just like Alohi Gilman. He had a very high pass rushing grade this year. I know the run defense grade wasn't as good. He's at about a 61 run defense grade. But a 78 pass rushing grade would actually put him in the top 10 for defensive tackles this year. He played almost 400 snaps this year as a rotational guy. And I think just getting another guy in this front that can give you meaningful snaps, especially on early downs, would be very valuable, right? I think Gervon Dexter at points looks very, very strong. I think Grady Jarrett at this point of his career has turned into almost more of a pass rushing specialist from the interior. Obviously not quite the same juice he had when he was a member of like that Falcons Super Bowl team, right? But Tim Settle, again, does he solve your defensive tackle problem? No, but it's a great rotational option. Keep those guys fresh, and it's a relatively reasonable deal. 2 years, $7 million. Again, very similar idea to Alohi Gilman. He gets to be a part of another championship caliber team while also giving himself another crack at an extension in his 30 to 31-year-old season. Next guy I'm looking at is Fred Johnson. He's been another rotational guy for the Philadelphia Eagles, a team that notoriously has had very good offensive lines. He was asked to play a whole lot this year. He played over 600 snaps, mostly because of some of the injuries that the Eagles experienced, right? Particularly to Lane Johnson, a future Hall of Famer that missed a good chunk of the season with injury. And Fred Johnson played pretty well, right? He's 6'7", 325 pounds. That's a pretty big human, right? His run blocking grade was less than stellar, right? 55 run blocking grade. Again, just referencing these PFF numbers so you guys can kind of visualize what kind of players these dudes are. Pass blocking grade was up to a 64 though, which is pretty good. Again, whether you trust the numbers or not, that's fine. If you turn on the tape, Fred Johnson is very clearly a better pass protector than he is a run blocker. And to be honest with you, I trust Dan Ruchar and Ben Johnson just with what they did with the run game, especially post-bye week this year. I think I trust them to get a guy like Fred Johnson in the building and help him figure out how do you become a more effective run blocker. And then the pass protection, I think with Ozzie Trapillo, right, suffering that torn patellar tendon, not fun, gonna miss, if not all, at least most of next year. I think having Fred Johnson as a guy that could step in with Theo Benedette, it's kind of funny, Fred Johnson and Theo Benedette are like, if you combine them, you'd have like an amazing left tackle, right? With Theo Benedette being a very plus run blocker and Fred Johnson being a plus pass protector. If you could just combine those guys' skills, you'd be just fine. Unfortunately, they both have some weaknesses in the other person's strength. But I think, bringing in that versatility, if Theo Benedette really just cannot take it the next step forward as a pass protecting left tackle, I think getting a guy like Fred Johnson that can, at the very worst, do a solid job protecting Caleb Williams' blind side, I think makes a lot of sense. Again, a very reasonable, manageable deal. And then this last one, and maybe the one I would be most excited about, is Tutu Atwell and bringing him in on kind of a 1-year sort of prove-it deal. Obviously a member of that Los Angeles Rams team since he was drafted by them just a few years ago. I think he just kind of got outplayed in that wide receiver room. Obviously, he's not taking snaps from Puka or Devontae Adams. You have guys like Kanata Mumpfield out of, I think it was Pitt, that played really well for the Rams this year. And Tutu Atwell just kind of couldn't find his spot in that system, right? I think with the absence of DJ Moore, again, is he a DJ Moore caliber player? No, right? Even just look at the physicality, it's completely different. Tutu Atwell's a little guy, but he can really, really run, which is why I'm so intrigued by him. I think that's something we might be missing, is a really, really blazing fast possible deep threat. And on only a 1-year deal, I think as him, like he kind of takes over that Olamide Zaccheaus role, right? As that hopefully wide receiver 4, wide receiver 3, depending on who's healthy. I think he could be a really strong slot option. I think he could be a good deep threat. I think there's a lot of things that Ben Johnson could do with him, especially in the screen game, right? He's pretty shifty after the catch. So really, and again, a $2.5 million deal for a guy like that, I think makes a lot of sense. If he plays really well this year, maybe he gets an extension, right? He's still pretty young. So yeah, I think, bringing in these 4 guys, again, we have proven that the roster as a whole is good enough to compete with some of the best teams in the NFL. So I think the goal as far as free agency goes, obviously you trade for Max Crosby, that's a little bit different, right? But as far as free agency goes, is just providing stability to a team that has shown they have the core players necessary to truly compete for a Super Bowl. You just need the supporting cast around those guys to make sure we don't mess it up, right? So I think Gilman, Settle, Johnson, Atwell, you spend roughly $13 million per year total on those guys. I think that's very reasonable. And I think provides that stability we're looking for. So with that being said, let's take a quick look at the depth charts for both offense and defense going into the NFL draft. So starting off with the offense, really not too many changes here, right? I think the offense was pretty clearly the strength of the team last year. So you want to keep a strength to strength, right? You don't want to mess it up. So you still got Caleb Williams. DeAndre Swift's a guy that a lot of people have been talking about. Do we cut him? Do we extend him? Personally, I think he played well enough to deserve another year on this team. However, I don't know if I'm ready to extend him quite yet. That running game really took off with the combination of him and Kyle Monangai down the stretch. However, I'm not quite sure he's worth like a significant running back payday. So I think we let him play out this year. If he, for some reason, really explodes and exceeds all expectations, maybe you revisit an extension opportunity. But I think having him play out this year, keeping that run game where it was at, I think makes a lot of sense. Obviously, you have Rome, you have Luther, Ja'Day Walker, Devin Duvernay, and then Tutu Atwell added in there. Again, right now, he'd be slated as kind of that wide receiver 3, depending on what you think of Ja'Day Walker. I personally am a huge Ja'Day Walker fan, Ja'Day All-Day Walker. I think he has potential to be, a wide receiver 3 caliber player, especially on this team. I think he, obviously still has a bit of a ways to go. Didn't play that much this year. But I think he'll have an expanded role next year. Obviously, Colston Loveland, I think, is already a top 5 tight end in the NFL. He will obviously be that starter for us next year. Cole Kmet, another guy people have talked about, do you get rid of him? Do you cut him? Do you trade him? Do you re-sign him? Right? I think he has a better chance of getting an extension than DeAndre Swift does. I think Cole Kmet just really embodies not only what Ben Johnson wants the locker room to be like, but also with as much 12 personnel, 1 running back, 2 tight ends, that Ben Johnson likes to run. I think Cole Kmet is that perfect complementary piece as a second tight end in Ben Johnson's offense. I think that holds a lot of value, and I think he'll be back. Right now, you have Theo Benedette at left tackle. He was a restricted free agent. He obviously comes back on a relatively cheap deal. Obviously, Ozzie Trapillo's on there. Again, like I mentioned earlier, probably won't play much, if at all, next year, just due to that knee injury. Joe Thuney, your protector of the year, obviously coming back. Drew Dahlman, obviously coming back. Jonah Jackson, obviously coming back. And then Darnell Wright's an all-pro. He is going to get a huge payday. Maybe it's this offseason, maybe it's the next. But he is going to get an absolute bag. But for now, we're going to talk about that being maybe mid-season or next season. And then Fred Johnson, right? I think he's kind of that swing tackle for you. Maybe if you're more confident with a guy like Fred Johnson, you slide him into that left tackle spot and then have Benedette be that kind of swing guy. But for now, this is what we're looking at with the offense. And then the defense, right? A little bit more turnover defensively. The front, you see Max Crosby there in blue. A huge, huge addition. You keep starters like Sweat, Dexter, and Jarrett. Still slated to start. You got guys like Tim Settle, Dayo Odeyingbo, and Austin Booker ready to rotate in. Dayo Odeyingbo, I'll be honest, I was pretty intrigued when we signed him. I do think it was a little bit too much money last offseason, but I thought there was a chance he had, with an expanded role, he could be really good for us. Obviously didn't really play that part prior to his season-ending injury. Hopefully in a, second year under Dennis Allen's defense, he can improve. We'll see. Tim Settle in there as that rotational guy, like I mentioned earlier. Shamar Turner, a guy that technically was drafted as a defensive tackle, but honestly started to play his best football as a defensive end before, again, stop me if you've heard this before, right? His season-ending injury. So we'll kind of see what role he carves out next year. It'll be very interesting to see if he can make a big impact. Linebacker, bit of a weakness, a position I think we must draft come April. You got Ruben Hippolyte, who I'm just going to tell you right now will not be a starter for the Chicago Bears, barring some super unexpected offseason injury. I didn't like that pick when it happened last year in the 4th round. He's a great athlete, but when he played this year, he just does not look like he's ready, right? Just mentally, he's just not quite there. I think he needs at least one more year of kind of sitting and developing before he's ready to, play a significant role. But right now he'd be that starter at will. So again, probably a place we're going to address. TJ Edwards will be back. He obviously, again, stop me if you've heard this before, had that broken leg, significant injury. I think he will be back in time to play next year. He played pretty well when he was out there. So, and it doesn't really make sense. We just gave him an extension. You can't get rid of him. So he'll be there. He'll be a starter. And then DeMarco Jackson, a guy I actually do feel really good about. Probably out of all these linebackers, the guy I feel the best about. We'll start there for now. I think he will be the starter next year at that Sam spot. And we'll kind of see how that goes. You still have a guy like Noah Sewell, another guy who had a significant injury, who will be a rotational guy behind each of these three. The cornerback room stays very similar to what it was. Obviously, you lose Nahshon Wright, but you still have Jalen Johnson, Tyreek Stevenson, Kyler Gordon, the guys that everybody thought was going to start coming into the year. Obviously, Jalen Johnson with his groin injury, Kyler Gordon with a multitude of injuries, and then Tyreek Stevenson kind of losing his job to Nahshon Wright throughout the year. A lot of question marks in the DB room, right? Can Jalen Johnson return to that all-pro form? Can Kyler Gordon stay healthy? Can Tyreek, keep his head on straight, make sure he's that player we need him to be as a CB2? And then Terrell Smith and Zoff Frazier, two guys that, really fit that Dennis Allen, big, tall, long corner kind of thing, especially with Al Harris. That's exactly what he was. I think he was really influential as far as Nahshon Wright's development went. But Terrell Smith, Zoff Frazier, two guys who either didn't or barely played at all last year, right? Can they develop into contributors as CBs, 3 and 4? We'll see. I really hope so. As we talked about earlier, Kevin Byard's back there at free safety. Obviously, you feel rock solid about that. Alohi Gilman will be slated as a starter at strong safety. We do need some safety depth, absolutely. There will probably be some type of low-level signing as like a 3rd or 4th guy. Maybe you bring back a guy like Jonathan Owens. But as far as, targets for the NFL draft go, I think defensive tackle, especially run-stopping defensive tackle, would be huge. I think off-ball linebacker to make sure Ruben Hippolyte can be that developmental piece we want him to be, huge. And then possibly corner and safety, we'll kind of see. I think definitely getting a rotational safety, or at least a long-term answer at safety, once Kevin Byard's retired and, maybe Alohi Gilman plays out that contract and isn't back. So we'll see. Let's jump into the PFF mock draft simulator, see what we can do to continue adding to the Bears. So, hopping right into PFF's mock draft simulator, we're going to select the Bears. Obviously, we're going to have to get rid of this first-round pick due to that Max Crosby trade, but we're still going to have a couple picks to work with. I'm going to do a 4-round mock draft, which seems kind of like a weird number. There's a couple reasons for that. Number one, I want to make sure we can talk about, at least a few picks after losing that first-round pick. And number two, like the reason I won't go to like a 7-round mock draft is I just don't know enough, like being completely transparent. I don't know enough about the prospects that, are pretty solidly 6th or 7th or undrafted free agent caliber prospects. But I do feel relatively good about, some of those early day 3 guys. So I want to make sure we can talk about them a little bit. So let's hop right into it. Again, you see the Raiders right here. We're going to trade with them, scroll down. We're going to snag Max Crosby. We're going to give them the 25th overall pick and DJ Moore. It says this will probably be, oh no, I didn't mean to do that. Let's fix that. I accidentally started it without submitting the trade. Let me go back and find the Raiders here. We'll give them 25. We'll give them DJ Moore. And they will give us, of course, Max Crosby. Side note, I don't know if anybody like me is a huge Bears fan and saw that interview that, or I guess podcast that DJ Moore, nope, not DJ Moore, that Caleb Williams did with Max Crosby on Max Crosby's show. All the more reason I think that he's going to join the Bears, right? They seem like they're really building a connection. Hopefully Caleb can kind of pry him away from Las Vegas. We're going to go ahead and force that trade, just make sure it goes through. Obviously, we're losing that pick. Here we go. We still have 3 picks to work with here near the back end of the second round, pick 57. Again, we're looking for a run-stopping defensive tackle. We're looking for a possible long-term answer at safety, maybe corner, and maybe left tackle, depending on how you feel about Fred Johnson and Theo Benedette. How do you feel about Ozzie Trapilla with his injury? Let's first look at defensive tackle. There's a couple guys that jump out to me. Number 1, Dominique Orange, big citrus. Definitely more of a run stopper than a pass rusher, which is fine, right? That's what we're looking for. A little bit of a down year this year compared to where I think he was in 2024. Still very effective, especially as that run defender, as a part of what's been a very good program under Matt Campbell at Iowa State. A guy that's played majority of his snaps in the A gap as that nose tackle. I think he's definitely an option. Another guy I'm a huge fan of is Darrell Jackson Jr. out of Florida State. He is an absolute massive human, right? 6'5", 337 pounds. He has absolutely oven mitts for hands. People are saying that he might have 35-inch arms, which is crazy. He's a guy that really stood out at the East-West Shrine Bowl and then got the call from the Senior Bowl. They said, hey, Darrell, let's go compete. And he shows up to the Senior Bowl and plays great there too, right? So he's been a part of 2 of those All-Star Circuit games. I think he's a guy that could definitely, help our run defense. Let's just kind of look at what else we have here, looking at safety. You got guys like Kamari Ramsey, who for some reason USC played him a lot in the slot this year. I thought he was a lot better last year as kind of that true safety role. I think he can play kind of both, box safety, more like middle-high safety. I think he'd be a valuable addition just to a DB room that needs some support. Another guy I really like is Zakee Wheatley. Obviously very highly graded. I'm not really as concerned about the grades, but just kind of a do-it-all kind of player, right? He's 6'2". He's a great tackler. He's good in space. He's good in coverage. Obviously this would be kind of like, out with a Penn State free safety in Jaquan Brisker and bringing in another one in Zakee Wheatley. But I do really like that idea. People are kind of all over the place on him. I know, I think it was Dane Brugler just put out his top 100 players. And I believe Zakee Wheatley was a top 60 player for him. Obviously PFF has him closer to 100. So we'll kind of see where he ends up. As far as tackles go, I'm not sure I'm ready to pick one here in a second. Blake Miller, a guy who's played, I think, solely right tackle. No, so he played a little bit of left tackle last year. Played almost exclusively right tackle throughout his career. Obviously, we have Darnell Wright there. Don't really need to do that. Caleb Tiernan, a guy who was a great pass protector for Northwestern this year at left tackle. There's been a lot of talk just due to measurables. As far as arm length goes, will he be a guard? We'll see. Jennings Dunker, a guy who I think will play guard, but he's an absolute mauler, man. He's a part of that amazing Iowa offensive line, but I think we're not really looking for an interior player. I think just based on what I'm seeing here, and on PFF, this is going to be a stretch, right? It's going to be an overdraft. I think I might go. Oh, I forgot to look at linebacker. Let's look at linebacker before we make any rash decisions here. I think Josiah Trotter's a guy you could consider. The only thing I worry about with Josiah Trotter is his coverage, right? You have a sub 50 coverage grade here, and I think when you turn on the tape, he does look a little bit lost at times in coverage. However, he is an unbelievable downhill player. He's one of those kind of old school bring the boom type linebackers. He has some huge hits on tape, so that's an option. Deontay Lawson, I just don't know if he's the athlete that a guy like Dennis Allen's going to want. Kyle Lewis, who absolutely lit up the Senior Bowl, especially in coverage. Again, I don't know if he's really where Dennis Allen's going to look. He's very undersized for a true linebacker. A lot of people kind of think he's going to transition to that overhang defender type role. And then Jacob Rodriguez, another guy I really like, who was uber productive for that Texas Tech defense last year. Obviously, a lot of people thought should have been, and I agree, a Heisman finalist. People are a little bit concerned about his testing. Obviously, we'll see, in a couple weeks at the Combine what kind of athlete he really is. Another guy I think I'd consider here. But I do think, looking at our options, I'm going to go with Darrell Jackson Jr., man. He is an absolute unit. I think he's going to be a very impactful run defender. I think he has a chance to be a better pro than he was in college, kind of playing for a struggling Florida State program. So we'll kind of bring him in. Maybe he doesn't start right away, but I think at the very worst, he's an early down contributor. And then a guy I talked about earlier, man, Zakee Wheatley's still here at pick 89. I'm going to have a very hard time not sprinting that card in. Just such a good player, man. So versatile. I think even if he doesn't start right away, I think will very quickly earn himself a starting role one way or another. And then Jacob Rodriguez is there too. So those would be the two guys that I'd really consider. Do you bring in a guy like Jacob Rodriguez? I think would be an immediate starter at linebacker, or Zakee Wheatley, who's very good and, overall a better athlete than Jacob Rodriguez, but maybe doesn't carve out a role day one. I think just because of, and again, I don't like drafting for need that much. I think, especially for good teams, you just want to take the best player available, keep building that roster, try to win a Super Bowl. But I think I just cannot stomach Ruben Hippolyte starting at linebacker. And I think Jacob Rodriguez would just be such a huge impact at that spot that it's going to be hard for me to pass on him there. And I think here in round 4, we can take a look at some of the safety options. Cole Wisniewski, a guy who's from our home state of Wisconsin, which is awesome. Obviously, another part of that, awesome Texas Tech defense. Some reason was a combine snub this year. I'm not sure, especially after, I think it was I can't remember if he was Senior Bowl or Shrine Bowl, but after his All-Star Circuit performance, I'm pretty shocked that he didn't get a combine invite. I think he's going to be a great athlete too. I think at his pro day, he'll test very well. He's a guy I'd consider. Maybe a guy that could use a little bit more development, right? I think he'd be kind of that traditional strong safety role. I think he does his best work in the box. He's a guy I'd consider here in the 4th. Another kind of sneaky, place I'd look is tight end. I don't know if Durham Smythe's going to be back. He's a guy that, Ben Johnson liked a lot. Maybe I'm a casual, maybe just not being in the building. I don't understand it. But whenever Durham Smythe was on the field, I didn't really notice an impact. He was brought in as like a run blocking specialist. And I was just never very impressed with it, right? I thought he did just as good of a job as, Cole Kmet and Colston Loveland did. But just, doesn't really add anything as a receiver. So I think tight end, with how much we use our tight ends, I think that could definitely be an option. I'm going to take a peek at running back. Just, can we bring in a guy that, after next year takes over for DeAndre Swift? I think Damone Claiborne's a guy I'd consider. Has some pretty significant receiving production over the past 2 years. A little bit undersized, but I think will be a very good tester, especially as far as that long speed goes. Corner, Julian Neal, who's a big dude, 6'2", over 200 pounds, I think would fit a lot of what Dennis Allen wants to do on defense. I'd consider that. Man, there's a couple different places I think we could go here. Let's take a look at safety again. I know he's ranked at 180, so when we see this grade from PFF, they're not going to like it because I'm doing a little bit of what they would consider overdrafting. But man, he was so productive this year, just in all facets of the game. I think I might go with Cole Wisniewski, right? He's 6'4", 220, an absolutely huge safety. I think putting him next to a guy like Kevin Byard, the next year or two could be awesome. He could immediately get in there as a run defender. I think I will go with Cole Wisniewski, even though he was a combine snub, and a lot of times, combine snubs don't go as high just because the NFL is trying to invite guys they think will get picked relatively high. I think he might be an exception to that, right? I think he will be drafted. I think he's a 4th round, 5th round caliber player. So I have no problem picking him at 129. So kind of reviewing this draft, right? We have Darrell Jackson Jr., Jacob Rodriguez, Cole Wisniewski. I think Jacob Rodriguez, obviously you see that B+ grade there. I think he'll start right away. I think Darrell Jackson Jr. at the very worst will be a 1st and 2nd down run defending option. Maybe he comes out for Maybe he comes out for Grady Jarrett on pass rushing downs. And then Cole Wisniewski, a guy who, might not start day one, maybe needs a little bit of development, especially as a true coverage player. But who better to learn from than guys like Kevin Byard, right? So I feel very good about this, especially when you add in that we spent a 1st round. You virtually spend a 1st round pick on Max Crosby, which I don't know about you guys, but that works for me. So yeah, this is kind of gonna kind of do it for our Bears offseason here. We'll take a quick look at the new depth chart after this. But yeah, I think you make a lot of key additions, especially defensively. And I think you're primed to continue not only hopefully winning the NFC North, but maybe winning the NFC and a possible Super Bowl berth next year. So let's take a look at the depth chart one more time. So obviously we're really only looking at the defense here. We made all defensive draft picks in the draft, at least as far as the first 4 rounds go. You'll have Darrell Jackson Jr. rotating in there at defensive tackle. I'm going to slate in Jacob Rodriguez as that weak side linebacker ahead of Ruben Hippolyte for now. Him, TJ Edwards, DeMarco Jackson, I think could move around a little bit depending on what we see as strengths. And then Cole Wisniewski behind Alohi Gilman as that strong safety. I think he has all the ability in the world to take over that spot in the coming years. So yeah, I think, you keep that offense that was very, very productive and explosive last year. You keep that as strength. You add a lot of meaningful contributors, hopefully, to the defense that struggled a lot last year. But I think, with another year under Ben Johnson's system, you're only hoping for improvement, right? And I think at this rate, you're only expecting improvement. So with that being said, that's going to conclude our very first episode of the JW Football Show. Thank you all for tuning in. I very much appreciate it. And for all of you that are Packers fans, which I know a lot of my friends are, I'm going to be doing a Packers rebuild episode next. So please stay tuned for that. And thank you guys very much. We'll see you later.